Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. It's been a minute, but we got a lot to talk about. Hey, everyone, I'm Gus Kattengell, joined as always by the star himself, Mr. Jim Eichenhoffer. Sir, good afternoon, man. How are you? We got a handful of things to talk about, even though we're in August.
I'm great, Gus. How are you doing these days?
I'm doing fantastic. Look, it was interesting this past week and weekend. I think two things really stood out to me. First and foremost, did you see Zion Williamson at his camp, man? It was awesome. What a great gesture by him saying, you know what, we're not even going to charge our campers, which was awesome. He wanted just to be there for the kids and everything. And I don't know about you, but I need to get on that same workout plan. He looks absolutely amazing. I'm juiced. I'm jacked. And then the schedule came out on Thursday. So yeah, in the last couple of days, man, it's I'm starting to get amped up knowing that basketball is a little around the corner.
Yeah, it's starting to feel a little bit more tangible when you think about it, that it's less than 2 months away as far as the preseason games and training camp and media day. So yeah, we're starting to turn the corner. For me, after Labor Day is when I really get locked in. So after a little bit more vacation and we get into September, maybe mid-September, and I start seeing like, hey, media day is only a couple weeks away. That's when I really am getting excited and ready to go. But yeah, we're almost there, Gus. We just got a little bit longer to wait.
Well, that explains the background as I see the beautiful, lush greenery of looks like a tropical landscape for you. So yeah, that's why you're not in front of me. You're still on vacation. I get it now. I get it.
No, I can take a little break from my extended, lengthy, amazing vacation to chat. But after this, I'm going right back onto the beach. So just so you know, guys.
That's good. Just don't get eaten by sharks. All right. That's all we need. We need you. We need you when the season starts. Look, it's interesting because one of the last times we chatted was obviously around Summer League, and having a chance to be there and call those games and talk to a lot of members of the front office, from David Griffin on to coaches like James Borrego. It's interesting because this is a different team, Jim, that we're going to be talking about here when they get to Nashville for training camp and starting the season. And a lot of it obviously is with DeJounte Murray, some of the pieces that took up a lot of minutes, did some of the gritty work for the team. They're no longer on the team. So who are going to be those guys? We got a handful of things to kind of try to figure out as the season goes. That said, what have you been able to see from before the schedule, during the summer, now that the schedule is out? How do people kind of feel what the outlook of this season is for this team?
I think the national reaction and projections for this team are actually maybe even more positive than you would expect based on the way the last season ended, / some of the question marks that the Pelicans have in terms of, we can talk about, what are they going to do with the starting lineup? What's going to happen at the center position? Some of the uncertainty. But I mean, just for example, looking across some of the power rankings let's be honest, they don't mean a lot. It's not that significant, but it's just something fun in the summer to look at, to see some of the other websites of how they project the Western Conference. The Athletic has the Pelicans 5th in their power rankings in the Western Conference. NBA.com had them 6th recently, earlier this month, and Sporting News a couple days ago had them 7th. So, I mean, to me, if you look at how formidable the Western Conference is, and you look at, the kind of competition that you're dealing with, I think it's a pretty big compliment to be picked 5th in the West right now, or 6th, to be considered a top 6 team. I think if you look at the teams that you're going against, that's a lot of confidence that some of these websites are showing. And I think we could talk about some of the reasons for that. I think, one of the things that I've mentioned a couple times on Twitter throughout the offseason, or I guess we probably should start calling it X at some point, maybe in the next year or two, maybe we'll switch over to that. But just the fact that the Pelicans have 6 of the top 85 players in the league, according to the Ringer, which has a pretty extensive list. They do a top 100 list. Pelicans are the only team in the league that has 6 players in the top 85. There's 3 other teams that have 6 guys in the top 100, but New Orleans is the only one that, like I said, top 85, 6 players. So I think people realize that the top of this roster is very talented and already was. And then they added DeJounte Murray in the offseason, who's in that top 85 list as well. They, like, as you referenced, Gus, they did give up some pieces of guys that were contributors off the bench last year, but they were able to get DeJounte Murray without trading any of their core big time pieces, starters, that kind of player. So I think when you look at all of that, I think that's part of where the respect that other people or other websites have for the Pelicans, as far as, you know, there's a lot of confidence. I haven't seen any, I mean, maybe people out there can find it, but I haven't seen anybody pick them to be, 10th or 11th or that kind of thing, which, in a lot of seasons, if you said like, oh, it's not really that big of a compliment to say that no one is picking them to finish 11th. But I think this year, if you look at some of the teams that are projected 11th in the West of how good this conference is going to be, that's actually a pretty big vote of confidence that, pretty much everyone has them as a play-in team at the very least.
I think one of the things that you bring up that's interesting is what you just said there at the end, because obviously, and what we do and I do a lot of times is look, and I get it. I mean, lists are lists. They're people's opinions. Sometimes, some of those opinions you don't understand, but for the most part, the people that are giving those opinions are people that follow the sport, that, go to games, watch games. At least you like to think so sometimes. So I think the fact that, to your point, you're not seeing, oh, they don't have a shot to make the playoffs. They'll be lucky to be pushing for, a play-in spot. They don't have any real star. I mean, that's not what this basketball team is. And I think that makes me feel good, right? I mean, obviously, if I'm a fan in that, okay, so you're at least starting here right there in that middle. And look, it's something that we talked about at the end of last season that I think is going to be a topic again, at least to start the season. The Western Conference is the Western Conference. And I know there's that term that when people hear play in, that makes people feel, oh, they're not a good basketball team. Your favorite team, the Lakers, haven't been 6 or above since LeBron's been there. They haven't been above 6. So, when you start looking at some of those teams that are in the play-in and what they can do, they're not bad basketball teams, I guess is what I'm getting at.
For
right?
Sure.
Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, Pelicans won 49 games last year and we're a play-in team. So, I mean, it's possible that could happen again where you win high 40s and you still don't finish in the top 6. So, no, your point is well taken. I mean, Phoenix was a star-studded team that barely got in the top 6 last year. It's going to take a lot. You're going to have to be really good to clear that line where you go right into the playoffs from the regular season. It hasn't been that way in the East. I mean, for the most part, if you're a play-in team in the East, that does mean that you're not very good, or you're not, at that level where people give you a ton of respect. But I think the West has 11 or 12 good teams this year, maybe 13 teams that people think. I mean, there really are 13 teams that I think people are giving a chance to be play-in teams and a good opportunity to be dangerous. So, I mean, obviously only 10 can be play-in or better. So yeah, it's going to be at a level that I think is even more competitive than it was last season.
We're going to get into the schedule. We're going to get into some of the games to keep an eye on, plus a really cool promotion that's coming up for you Pels fans out there, the team is going to be doing. But before we get to that, one final thing for you, because I think a lot of times outlook, it's in the same neighborhood of expectation, isn't it, Jim? Like a team's or a fan base's outlook, I think it's right there in that same neighborhood of expectation. And I wonder if the raised expectations, and look, this is what the Pelicans have wanted. This is what Pels fans have wanted, right? It's no longer, and you saw it last year. And I think maybe when you were talking about the comparison between national and local outlooks for this team, I think are tied to expectations, right? It's gone from, hey, can it be a play-in team, to 6 or better, to hosting and all those things. So the higher the expectation level, I think, Jim, from the fan base, the differing outlook is kind of what it gets to. Like maybe their expectation level is at a level where their outlook is going to be based on what they think they should be or where they want them to be. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this team is at the point too where it's understandable for fans to be like, okay, they've made incremental improvements. They've improved their win total every season the last few years, but now it's time to make a big jump and it's time to make a big impact in the postseason. Obviously, I mean, I remember you and I, the 81st game of the regular season, CJ McCollum makes a 3 against Golden State, and I'm sitting there thinking they're not going to be in the play-in. We don't need to go back through what happened in the weekend, that weekend where everything that could go wrong went wrong, and then they ended up in the play-in game. But I mean, they were that close to being top 6 last year. I think the expectations are definitely high, and when you add a player like DeJounte Murray, it's understandable that they're even higher, because I think he addresses some of the specific problems that they had last year, with probably the most important one being the way that they struggled in clutch games, the way that they had a tough time in close games. He made 3 game-winning baskets by himself last year. So I think it's understandable that people say, you know, they almost won 50 games last year. They added a point guard who addresses some of their issues. And so therefore the expectations are pretty high. Another thing I would throw in too, that I actually think is not part of what we see in the power rankings and the offseason discussion about the NBA, is people have a hard time, and this is understandable. It's hard to project internal improvement. It's hard to, you know, people always look at like, okay, this team added these players, they subtracted these players. What's harder to gauge is the players that you already have on your roster, especially the guys that are in their early 20s. How much are they going to improve? How much better are they going to be in the following season? I think that's one factor to me that, and I'm not, by no means am I complaining about the way people are projecting the Pelicans, because we just went through that, that things are pretty favorable. I mean, there was an ESPN podcast segment recently where all 3 guys on the panel, basically it was buy or sell Pelicans. They all said sell. That's one of the maybe less favorable reactions, but I think overall they've been good in terms of people expectations. But I mean, the Pelicans, to go back to my point, Trey Murphy, Herb Jones, Zion Williamson, DeJounte Murray, even to some extent, I think they're all at a phase in their career where they can come back in an offseason and be a lot better than they were the year before. So I think that's another factor that's hard to predict. I mean, we don't know. We're not there. The media is not going to be able to be there in the gym every day during the summer to watch guys and see what they're working on. It's really hard to predict what players are going to improve. But I do think that's another thing that's works in the favor of New Orleans. The fact that they've done well in a lot of these drafts lately. They've picked up guys that are at that stage of their career where, you know, there's 3 guys on this team that are in that just finished year 3. They're going into year 4. A lot of times players like that come back and they're a lot better players. And, you know, to use one example from last season across the NBA too, I was looking at the most improved player voting from last season. The top 5 guys: Tyrese Maxey, Kobe White, Chicago; Alperen Şengün, Houston; Jalen Williams, OKC; Jalen Brunson, New York. 4 of those 5 teams, especially Houston, OKC, and New York, were among the best stories team-wise in the league. And if you look at it, it's easy to see. It's easy to kind of draw a direct line from. You have a player or 2 who makes some of the best improvements in the league individually, and that therefore your team makes a big jump and exceeds expectations, goes deep in the playoffs, wins a bunch of regular season games. I think that's something to keep an eye on as well for New Orleans. When you look at going into this season, the fact that they have multiple guys, I mean, look at the jump that Herb made individually last year. If you see that kind of thing or something similar to that from Trey, you know, hopefully injuries won't curtail him and sidetrack him a little bit this season the way they did last year. Those things I think are all areas where I think the Pelicans have a little bit more upside to get better than some of the other teams in the West that might have more veteran guys or more players that are deeper into their career. With Phoenix being one example of, you know, they have guys that are at the veteran stage where you probably aren't going to improve a ton. Whereas I think the Pelicans still have room with various key guys that they can get a lot better because they're still early in their career.
Yeah, great points. No doubt to make there as well. Jim, 65 days, sir, until the regular season kicks off. It'll be over at the Smoothie King Center. It's going to be against the Chicago Bulls, and that schedule came out on Thursday. As we transition now looking into the schedule, what are some of the things that stood out to you aside from the fact that this team's going to open the season and close the season here in New Orleans?
Yeah, I think I made a list basically for this of things that I expected on the schedule and things that surprised me. I think I'm going to start with what surprised me, partly because it ties in pretty well to the very beginning of the schedule. I was a little bit surprised by the competition at the beginning of the schedule. If you think about it, we've had so many years where the first couple weeks of the season, the Pelicans are playing the best teams in the league and they're playing elite squads. And even though I think injuries have been a factor with some of the slow starts that New Orleans has gotten off to that have aggravated the fan base and aggravated me, I think there's also been a factor of the schedule. So I think what's a little different about this year that surprised me is that they do play several games against teams that were near the bottom of the standings last year or teams that didn't make the playoffs. So you hope that that means that contributes to and leads to them getting off to a good start. I feel like I would love to see, like a 7-3 start in the first 10 games or something like that, as opposed to some of the years where by Thanksgiving, you were already in a hole and you were already trying to dig out of the way that you started the season, including the first year that Willie Green was here, where they had a really rough October or November, but then by the end of the season, they were able to make the playoffs. For example, I mean, they have 3 games against Portland in the first 8 games of the season. A team that struggled last year, a team that a lot of people are picking 15th in the West. By no means am I sitting here and saying like, oh, that means you can just walk out on the court and win those games. But they have some games against teams that are kind of in rebuilding mode over the first dozen games of the season. So that to me was a pleasant surprise. Second surprise that I had on my list was there's 10 instances where the Pelicans play the same team in consecutive games. So the NBA has really, at least in the case of New Orleans, has really increased the number of baseball series. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not really sure. But I mean, travel-wise, I think that's definitely helpful that, there's 5 different instances where they play a game against 2 games in a row against a Western Conference team in the same city. So just an interesting quirk. Another thing that surprised me was the longest road trip of the season is only 4 games. That's unusual. It feels like there's a lot of years where they'll have 3 or 4 road trips that are 5+ games. Not really sure what the reason for that is, but the schedule is definitely more in like shorter blocks this year than it has been in the recent past.
I think it's a great point because when I look at the last 2 years too, I kind of feel that, right? We will joke sometimes that we forgot what Todd looks like, which is really hard to do when you think about it. He's very distinctive. But no, I mean, it's true, right? Something like 6 games in 10 days or 10 games and, whatever, to where you do get that. I think that is something that stands out to you. And look, you're not disrespecting anybody, but it would be different if some of those first 10 games, because we're going to get to that, because that's something I want to ask you about too, that first 10 and the importance of it. Willie Green says it's important, but it'd be totally different if Minnesota's in there, OKC's in there, Denver's in there, the Bucks are in there, Boston's in there. That's a much different 10-game slate, to your point, than Portland and Golden State and some of the other teams in the East like Atlanta as well. So when you look at those first 10, because that's what I look like too, that start, that beginning, you talked about expectation level and outlook. Everybody feels better if you get a good start. And it's something that Willie Green doesn't shy away from. That first 10, he looks at the season and blocks at 10. But when you look at the first 10 games, we did this last year when we looked at months, right? How many wins, how many losses do you think you need to kind of do that? 7-3 is the first thing that pops in my head, where I'm like, you have more chance than not stepping on the court, equal, if not better talent than some of these teams. Go take care of your business. As you mentioned in that opening segment, this team missed a top 6 seed by a game. Every game matters. If you step on the court and you have better talent, you've got to win those games.
Sure. And I think the importance of a good start to the season also comes when you have a little bit of a different mix of players and maybe some different lineups and stuff like that. You want to be able to build confidence right off the bat, and you want to be able to say what we're doing is working. What we're doing with the players that we have in these roles is something that we can stick with. When you get off to a bad start, I think sometimes, especially if you're asking guys to sacrifice their role or play fewer minutes or get less shots, I think if you get off to a bad start, it's easier for players to say like, why am I sacrificing X, Y, and Z if we're not winning? It's worth it doing it if the team is winning and playing at a level where, I can live with, taking a smaller role or taking a kind of an altered role. But I mean, to what you mentioned about one game makes a huge difference. I think in the West too, I mean, we have gotten to the point where I feel like 10, 12 years ago, you could easily say like, well, it's an 82 game season. a game or two isn't that big of a deal. But I mean, when we look at it, it's been multiple years now where one game, even just for the Pelicans, I mean, you could say this for a lot of teams across the NBA, where if they had one more win at the end of the season, their positioning would have been a lot different. Last year, they would have been a top 6 team if they had won one more game. The year before that, they would have been, I think they would have been in the top 8. And as we know, the difference between 8 and 9 is huge when it comes to the play-in tournament, where you either get 2 chances to win one game or you have to win both to advance. So, I mean, it's definitely important they have been able to have bad starts and overcome it. But I mean, it depends on what your definition of overcoming is. I feel like right now, if the goal is to finish in the top 6 or have a chance for top 4, there isn't going to be any segment of the season where you're going to say, we can go 3-7 or 4-6 and be able to recover from that. So I think for all of those reasons, I think the start of the season is important. One last thing I was going to mention too, under my surprises category, and this goes a little bit along with what we're talking about in terms of there aren't that many long road trips. I was surprised that the Super Bowl trip isn't longer than 4 games.
Yeah.
At the beginning of February, Super Bowl is on February 9th. They have a 4-game road trip from February 3rd to February 10th. I thought on the front end of that, they were going to have to clear out of New Orleans a lot earlier than they are. They have a home game on January 31st against Boston, which is only 9 days before the Super Bowl is played. I thought that they were going to be like, you have to be gone for a longer period. Gus and Jim, you can't even go in the arena. Get the heck out of here.
Right. Yeah.
We need to clear the way for, every football activity that needs to be happening here and all of the structure and infrastructure that's put in logistical stuff. But so that was the last thing on the list that surprised me.
One thing that I want to ask you too, and we always do this last year, there was a month where you just had to tread water. Remember, there was a month of basketball where like just tread water, be above 500, and the Pels did that. You kind of touched on it just now. I was curious when I knew the schedule was coming out, what February looked like, because I was with you. I'm like, we'll never see this team. I mean, I don't know what it looks like, because I thought they'd be gone a lot with Mardi Gras and the Super Bowl. That said, it's not, what is it, like 7 and 4, something like that, 7 road games for the month of February being at home. But I'm looking at that last game in January. And really, if you want to, let's go to the last homestand to the end of February. Jim, that's my gauntlet month. You know me, I love my gauntlets. And that's the month of basketball to me. That's very interesting. You have some road trips, like you said. The NBA trade deadline is there. You have the All-Star break is there. That month of basketball, I think, could go a long way to determining where you're going to be. And I say that because that's that last homestand. Dallas, Boston, pretty good teams. Then you got Denver, Sacramento, OKC, Sacramento, Dallas, San Antonio. Those 2 teams, I mean, those 2 games against the team that, Wembanyama, look, they beat the Pelicans the last week of the regular season last year. So they're not easy. And then you got Denver, you got Phoenix to end the month of February. So that's a stretch of stars, right? Stars, top 5, top 10 players in the league. Wembanyama is one of those guys, I think, coming up in the future. But other than that, it's Jokic, it's Luka, Sacramento battles. I don't think they've forgotten that the Pels kind of had their number a year ago. So just when I look at that month of basketball, man, that's a tough stretch against very good teams, contenders, and if not, rising unicorns like Wembanyama. So that to me, I think is the toughest part of the season.
Sure. And how about this, Gus? February is the only month of the calendar where they play entirely against the Western Conference. Every other month they play, at least have some games against the East. And even more so, if you fast forward to the beginning of March, I mentioned this in one of the things I wrote last week. The first 7 games of March are also against the West. So they have 18 consecutive games from February 3rd at Denver to March 15th at San Antonio, where they play only Western Conference teams. So when you get into the tiebreakers and the standings in the West, I mean, that stretch, like you said, is going to be so crucial and something that could be the most important span of the season. And I think it's also interesting too, that if you really subtract there's really realistically only two teams in the West that people look at as rebuilding teams, as teams that aren't focused on trying to win a lot this year. Utah, Portland are those two teams. I mean, they don't appear in any of those games either. So you're playing against all of the teams for about, 6 consecutive weeks. You're playing only Western Conference teams and only teams that have their eyes on being part of the postseason in the spring.
All right. Well, Jim, now I want to focus on something very specific, the home games. We talked about it a season ago. This team was really good on the road. I think if you want to be 6 or better, right, Willie Green will probably tell you, this team will tell you, you got to win some of these home games. I mean, to the point where we joked, I mean, shoot around at home. What can we do to make it more comfortable?
Yeah.
Because the 3-point shooter, like this team just shot better. They played differently, especially beyond the arc a season ago, road and home. So home's going to be a big factor, I think, this season, and a big focus by the team already. We got a little interesting promotion coming up where, Jim, a couple of these games, I don't know, can't miss games or games that of note where the team wants to be a part of the fan base together. Explain this.
So basically what we have is it's called the Marquee Matchups Ticket Giveaway. And it's part of the article that I wrote last week that's called the 7 Can't Miss Home Games on the Pelicans schedule for 24-25. Basically, fans can enter to win. You have to click on the article. You can click on it on the website or the app, and it's a contest. And basically what they're doing is the team is giving away 2 lower level tickets to each of these 7 games to one fan. So a fan, whoever wins this, is going to be very pleased because they're going to be getting tickets, 2 free tickets to 7 different home games. And not only are they 7 Pelicans home games, but they're also, as selected by me, the most can't miss of the season. So I came up with a list of 7 home games, and people can second guess this. I mean, there's room for other opinions, but I guess since I was the one that came up with the list, this is the final decision on which of the 7 games you get tickets to. So I'm sure whoever wins this is going to be very happy with the result of that. If you want me to go through them, basically I can go through them quickly. First on the list is the home opener, October 23rd against the Bulls. I think that goes without saying that the home opener is going to be fun and a game that people usually remember. November 16th against the Lakers, my favorite squad.
There it is. There it is. I was waiting for that. I thought for sure you were ready. I mean, I couldn't wait for that one. You know what? It's interesting because you're saying that lower level seats. I don't think people realize they're probably going to be your seats. The team's just going to tell you, Jim, get on up here for this game, and you'll go sit upstairs with the graph and everything. No one knows that you actually have a floor seat. So it might be Jim Eichenhoffer seat for all I know. But look, I'm with you. Look, that opening against Chicago, big, right? Kind of again the expectation level. But I kind of think. Let me ask you this, because you said that I couldn't wait to ask you. Is the Lakers game a rivalry?
I think it is for Pelicans fans. I don't know. I guess it depends on what you define as rivalry.
Right.
I'm not sure.
You know what I'm talking about? Like when the Falcons come in town for the Saints, there's a little more juice. You know what I'm saying? Like that, so. Or when a team that's kind of had you, there's a little more juice. Who do you think the team has that, or the fan base has a little extra juice for certain teams that come in?
I definitely do. I mean, if you look at if you listen to the reaction when the Lakers are here too, the amount of booing definitely goes way up for certain individual players on the squad and just the Lakers in general. I feel like it's been a pretty historical thing where, I mean, honestly, this isn't unique to New Orleans. I feel like the vast majority of the league, especially the Western Conference, if you talk to people in a lot of these other cities, they don't like the Lakers. I think that animosity and hatred, or whatever you want to call it, definitely decreased during this era where pre-LeBron, where the Lakers missed the playoffs, 6 or 7 years in a row,
right,
and they weren't really considered a threat. It was kind of like they were the Lakers in colors and jersey only. But I think it's come back the last few years, especially with them being the team that gets a ton of attention that's not really commensurate with what they've actually accomplished on the court. So obviously they made the Western Conference Finals a year ago. But I mean, I think if you would ask most fans, especially fans of other teams that aren't fans of the Lakers, they would say that there's a little, not sure what the word is for it. I don't know. There's some ill feelings about the fact that we listen to them constantly and listen about them constantly, and that they've been a play-in team the last few years.
All right, so your first two of the 7, Chicago and the Lakers. Give me the other 5.
Yes. Then we have November 22nd, about a week or so before Thanksgiving, Golden State Warriors. December 22nd, nice holiday game against the Denver Nuggets. January 15th, Dallas Mavericks, reigning Western Conference champions. January 31st against Boston. And then March 9th against the Memphis Grizzlies. So those are the 7 games I picked. This was not easy, Gus. To try to narrow it down to 7 teams, definitely no easy feat, but that's what they pay me for, to make the tough decisions and really get in there and there's definitely a few games that I could have put on the list, but those are the 7 I came up with.
Yes, tough decisions is synonymous when you get 3 commas in your paycheck. I mean, that's how it works. So, Jim, I appreciate you doing that hard work. But look, that's the thing. Look, I think when you look at the schedule, expectation levels, but you don't know what team is going to be that team this year that maybe is like OKC. I mean, I thought they'd be in the mix. I didn't think they'd win the top seed in the West, right? So you're going to have a surprise or two. I think there's a team that I fear is going to be in that mix just because I know who's coming back and he should be healthy and he's not suspended. It's Ja Morant and the Grizzlies. They're going to affect those standings somehow, some way. We saw it firsthand in New Orleans twice last year. His influence can be, but I just think it's exciting because this is a good team. But Jim, I think this is going to be a different team than the teams that we've seen the last couple of seasons. And I think a lot of it's because of what DeJounte Murray can maybe bring, can maybe hopefully fix some of the issues that the Pels have had, like turnovers and offense there late in the game, closing out those things. So I got to imagine on a dry eraser board in Nashville, there's 2 or 3 things. Maybe we can do that the next podcast. Like, what would you put on there? I think winning home games, closing out games, those are things I think that you focus on as you get ready to start the season because you've got talent. It's about closing games. And I think it's about making sure that you can, shoot better on the road. I mean, at home in the 3-point shots. I mean, I think there's specific things, but those are things that you can work on. Those are things you can coach and teach. Getting that talent to do that is different. And I think, harder. And I think this team has talent. Now you just got to refine it. Does that make sense? Like, that's how I look at this season. Can you refine talent that you have? And I think this is a very talented team. Can you refine it? And I think you can really take that next step.
Yeah, Gus, I'm really looking forward to, I mentioned earlier the progress of some of the younger players on the team, but also DeJounte Murray, just the impact that he's going to be able to have. He's really never, since he's been in a big role in the NBA, setting aside his rookie year, his first couple of years where the Spurs were a veteran team, this is the first time that I think he's ever had this level of talent around him. So I'm really curious to see, what he can do with playing side by side with Zion, some of the other players that they have, the talent that they have. It's going to be really fun. And by the way, last thing too, I want to mention on my 7 can't miss home games. Think about this, Gus, in terms of how loaded the NBA is overall. OKC didn't make the list. Minnesota didn't make the list. Philly didn't make the list. Milwaukee, Phoenix, all of those teams and all of the big names that are among that handful of squads. New York also not on the list. I mean, there were so many good games that could have made the cut. So it just kind of shows you the competition where they're at. And when you look at the schedule, there's one of the things I noted last week, they start the season with Pelicans with 3 games against teams that had losing records last year. That's tied for the longest stretch they have of the entire season of consecutive games where they play teams with losing records last year. So the NBA is so tough. I think this is the most competitive and rugged it's been over the last bunch of years. So should be fun. And I'm really looking forward to it. There's a lot of reasons to be excited about this team.
I'm with you, man. And again, 65 days as we start this brand new work week here on August 19th until the regular season opener on that Wednesday night against Chicago. So we have a lot to talk about here before then. And once that season gets going, I'm super excited. Looking forward to another fun season with you, Jim. So we'll see you soon, bud.
Looking forward to it, Gus. Can't wait for us to get started here in a few weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And if you want to go see anything that Jim just talked about in terms of those games and how to get in that awesome promotion, just go to pelicans.com, and Jim's stuff is on there. The promotions are on there. The schedule's on there. So go check that out. As always, appreciate you tuning in, and thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. Join us 3 times per week on pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcast. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhoffer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.